Of all the ghosts that haunt the hallways of music history, the quietest are often the most unsettling. They aren't the spirits of stars who went out in a blaze of glory, their names forever etched into the public consciousness. They are the specters of those who simply vanished. The voices that filled our radios, that sang us to sleep or soundtracked our heartbreaks, and then one day fell silent. We assumed they retired, found happiness away from the spotlight, or simply moved on. But sometimes the silence hides a story far more complex and far more tragic. In the glittering, high-stakes world of 1980s country music, fortunes were made and broken with the release of a single album. It was a time of crossover pop, big hair, and even bigger ballads. Amidst the legends like Kenny Rogers, Dolly Parton, and George Jones, a new generation of artists was fighting for a piece of the Nashville dream. One of those voices belonged to a man named Mark Gray. If you were listening to country radio back then, you knew his name. You knew his soulful keyboard-driven sound. You almost certainly knew his powerful duet with the first lady of country music, Tammy Wynette. His star was on a fiery ascent. And then he disappeared from the radar. Not slowly, but almost completely. He didn't just leave the industry. He seemed to have been erased by it, leaving behind a profound silence that for decades, few people ever thought to question. This is the story of that silence. It's a story about the brutal machinery of fame, the fragility of a creative soul, and what happens when the applause finally, irrevocably fades away. To understand Mark Gray's rise and fall, you have to understand the world he was trying to conquer. The Nashville of the late 1970s and early 1980s was a city in the middle of an identity crisis, and a very profitable one at that. The gritty, traditional sounds of honky-tonk were giving way to something smoother, more polished, and far more palatable to mainstream pop audiences. This was the era of the countrypolitan sound and the urban cowboy craze. Artists like Barbara Mandrell and Eddie Rabbitt were blurring the lines between country pop and soft rock, creating a hybrid sound that dominated the airwaves. This was a tectonic shift. For decades, country music had been a regional passion, a sound for rural America. Now, it was a national phenomenon. Record labels in Nashville, once considered provincial outposts, were now competing directly with their counterparts in Los Angeles and New York. The money was bigger, the stakes were higher, and the pressure was immense. An artist wasn't just competing with other country singers. They were competing with Michael Jackson and Madonna for a spot on the charts. Into this pressure cooker stepped a band called Exile. Today, most people remember them for their one massive global pop hit from 1978, the sultry disco-tinged rock ballad Kiss You All Over. It was a song that was both a blessing and a curse. It made them international stars, but it also pigeonholed them. They were a rock band from Richmond, Kentucky, who suddenly had a #1 pop hit. But when their follow-up singles failed to capture the same magic, their label, Warner Brothers, dropped them. For many bands, that would have been the end of the story. A one-hit wonder destined for nostalgia tours. But Exile refused to fade away. They saw the changing landscape in Nashville and decided to pivot. They were, at their core, incredible musicians and songwriters. They leaned into their Kentucky roots and began writing country music. It was a gamble, a complete reinvention. And to spearhead this new sound, they needed a new member, someone who understood the soul and melody that could bridge the gap between their rock past and their country future. In 1979, they found their man. His name was Mark Gray. He was a keyboardist and singer from Vicksburg, Mississippi, with a voice that dripped with Southern soul and a talent for crafting unforgettable melodies. His arrival marked the beginning of Exile's second and arguably more successful life. It also set the stage for his own brief, brilliant, and ultimately heartbreaking journey to stardom. Mark Gray was born in 1952 in Vicksburg, Mississippi, a place steeped in the deep, rich soil of the blues. He grew up in a musical family, honing his skills on the piano from a young age. But like many aspiring artists, he pursued a practical path first, studying to be a pharmacist's assistant. Music, however, was a relentless calling. He soon left the world of prescriptions for the world of performance, paying his dues in clubs and bars across the South. His journey eventually led him to Nashville, the magnetic North for any country musician with a dream. It was there, in the heart of Music City, that his path crossed with Exile. The band, reeling from being dropped by their pop label, was in the midst of a transformation. With Mark on keyboards and contributing his soulful vocals, their sound began to crystallize. It was a country, but it was modern. It was infused with the pop and R&B sensibilities that Mark brought to the table. His influence was immediate and profound. He co-wrote many of their biggest hits during this new era, songs that would define the sound of country radio in the early 1980s. Between 1983 and 1985, Exile, with Mark Gray as a key creative force, was unstoppable. They scored a staggering 10 number-one country singles. Hits like Woke Up in Love, I Don't Want to Be a Memory, and Give Me One More Chance were not just chart toppers, they were anthems. Mark's keyboard hooks were instantly recognizable, and his harmony vocals gave the band a smooth, polished sheen that audiences adored. He was living the dream. He was a member of one of the hottest bands in country music, writing and performing number-one songs. But for a man with Mark Gray's level of talent and ambition, being part of a group, even a wildly successful one, wasn't the final destination. He had his own voice, his own stories to tell. The allure of a solo career, of seeing his own name on the album cover, was powerful. In 1982, while still riding the high of Exile's success, he made the monumental decision to leave the band and strike out on his own. It was a huge risk. The history of music is littered with talented members of famous bands who failed to find success as solo artists. Nashville, in particular, is a town that loves momentum but is notoriously unforgiving of gambles that don't pay off. Mark, however, had the wind at his back. His reputation as a hit songwriter and a phenomenal musician preceded him. He quickly signed a deal with a major label, Columbia Records, the home of legends. In 1983, he released his debut solo album titled Magic. The title was fitting. The lead single, Left Side of the Bed, was a solid top 10 hit, establishing him as a viable solo act. The follow-up, If All the Magic Is Gone, climbed even higher. The industry was buzzing. It seemed Mark Gray had successfully made the jump from hit band member to bona fide solo star. And then came the moment that should have cemented his place in the country music pantheon forever. It was a project that, on paper, seemed almost impossibly ambitious for a relatively new solo artist. He decided to record a new version of the iconic 1977 ballad, Sometimes When We Touch, a song made famous by Dan Hill. But Mark had a vision. He wanted to transform it into a duet, a powerful emotional exchange between two singers. And he didn't just want any duet partner. He wanted the best. He wanted a legend. He set his sights on Tammy Wynette. To understand the sheer audacity of this, one has to remember who Tammy Wynette was in the mid-1880s. She wasn't just a star, she was royalty, the first lady of country music. Her voice, trembling with pain and resilience, was one of the most iconic sounds in American music history. For a newcomer like Mark Gray to approach an icon of her stature was a long shot, to say the least. But somehow, he did it. Whether through sheer persistence, the quality of his voice, or the conviction of his vision, he convinced Tammy to join him in the studio. The result was breathtaking. The recording of Sometimes When We Touch by Mark Gray and Tammy Wynette is a masterclass in emotional performance. It wasn't just a duet, it was a conversation, a raw, vulnerable confession. His smooth, soulful tenor intertwined with her legendary, heart-wrenching vocals. The song became a massive hit in 1985, cracking the top 10 on the country charts and becoming a staple on adult contemporary radio. It was a career-defining moment. He had shared the microphone with the First Lady of Country and held his own. He had arrived. The future looked limitless. He had the voice, the songwriting talent, the hit records, and the respect of his peers. But in the ruthless world of Nashville, the brightest lights can often cast the darkest shadows. And the magic, as his own song warned, can vanish in the blink of an eye. The human element is often the first casualty of the music business. Behind the chart positions, the record sales, and the glossy magazine covers are real people with real lives and real vulnerabilities. For Mark Gray, the man behind the music was a study in contrasts. He was a confident, charismatic performer on stage, yet those who knew him well spoke of a quieter, more sensitive soul off stage. He was a product of the Mississippi Delta with an innate R&B groove who found his home in the structured world of Nashville country. His creative process was deeply personal. He didn't just write songs, he bled them. His second solo album, released in 1986, was titled This Old Piano. The title track is perhaps the most revealing song he ever wrote. It's a love letter to his instrument, but it's also a poignant metaphor for his life. He sings of a piano that's been with him through thick and thin, a silent confidant that knows his secrets, his heartbreaks, and his dreams. A line from the song resonates with haunting clarity. This old piano knows the truth. It knows what I've been going through. It feels less like a performance and more like a confession. It's the sound of a man who found his truest expression not in the roar of the crowd, but in the quiet solitude of his own creativity. This album, despite its artistic merit and the deeply personal title track, was a commercial disappointment. It failed to produce a major hit. In the fast-moving, unforgiving calculus of 1980s Nashville, this was a death sentence. An artist was only as good as their last hit, and Mark's momentum had stalled. Soon after the album's release, Columbia Records, the very label that had championed him, dropped him. Just like that, it was over. The whirlwind of success, leaving a #1 band, launching a hit solo career, singing with Tammy Wynette, had lasted barely 3 years. The industry that had built him up had, with cold efficiency, cast him aside. This is a common story in Nashville, but the speed and finality of Mark's fall were particularly brutal. He had played the game and won, only to have the rules change overnight. What does a man do when the dream he has chased his entire life evaporates? For Mark Gray, the answer was not to fight a losing battle. He didn't claw for another record deal or try to reinvent himself again. He simply walked away. He retreated from the Nashville spotlight and settled into a quiet life in Lebanon, Tennessee, a small city east of the music capital. He and his wife, Lisa, built a life far from the demands and disappointments of the industry. He never stopped being a musician, of course. That was in his blood. He continued to write songs, and his talent remained undeniable. In a twist of fate, he found more lasting success as a songwriter for others than he did as a solo artist. He penned massive hits for one of the biggest bands in country music history, Alabama, including the #1 smash Take Me Down and The Closer You Get. He also wrote for artists like Janie Frick and the Oak Ridge Boys. His melodies and lyrics were still shaping the sound of country radio, but his own voice was no longer on it. His name was now in the fine print of the album credits, a secret known only to industry insiders and the most dedicated fans. To the outside world, he had become a ghost, a name from the past, a "where are they now" trivia question. He lived a life of quiet anonymity, a stark contrast to the days of tour buses and television appearances. Those who knew him in Lebanon described a kind, gentle man, a loving husband who was a part of the community. They saw Mark Gray, the neighbor, not Mark Gray, the former country star. But one can only imagine the complex emotions churning beneath that quiet surface. To have tasted that level of success, to have shared a microphone with a legend, and then to have it all taken away must have left a wound that never truly healed. He was living proof of the industry's cruelest paradox. Your talent can be good enough to get you to the top, but it's rarely enough to keep you there. The story of Mark Gray is not one of scandal or public controversy in the traditional sense. There were no headline-grabbing arrests, no dramatic fallouts played out in the tabloids. The controversy surrounding his life is quieter, more insidious, and far more profound. It is the controversy of a system, an industry that can create a star and then discard him with alarming ease, leaving behind a wake of psychological and emotional damage. The central debate in Mark's story is whether he was a victim of the Nashville machine or simply a casualty of changing tastes and bad luck. The truth, as it often is, likely lies somewhere in between. The Nashville of the mid-'80s was shifting once again. The smooth, pop-infused country that had been Mark's specialty was beginning to give way to the new traditionalist movement, led by artists like Randy Travis, George Strait, and Dwight Yoakam, who brought back a more raw, honky-tonk sound. Mark's polished, keyboard-heavy style was suddenly seen as dated. He was a man out of time, a fate that befalls countless artists. But this explanation, while factually accurate, feels incomplete. It doesn't account for the human cost. The Nashville music industry, for all its talk of family and community, operates on a brutal 3-year cycle. An artist is expected to deliver hits consistently. If they falter, if an album underperforms, the label's investment and their interest vanishes. There is little room for artistic development or a sophomore slump. It's a high-pressure environment that can be incredibly damaging to a creative person's psyche. For Mark, the abandonment must have felt intensely personal. He had done everything right. He had paid his dues, he had written the hits, he had delivered a classic duet. He had proven his talent time and time again. To be dropped by his label wasn't just a business decision, it was a rejection of him as an artist and perhaps as a person. It sent a clear message: you are no longer valuable to us. This leads to the most difficult and sensitive part of his story, his death. On November 2nd, 2016, Mark Gray passed away at his home in Lebanon, Tennessee. He was 64 years old. In the initial reports, no cause of death was given, a silence that was unusual for a public figure, even one who had retreated from the spotlight. The official record remains silent to this day. However, within the tight-knit Nashville music community, a different story began to circulate, shared in hushed tones among friends and former colleagues. The narrative that emerged, and has since been confirmed by many sources close to him, was that Mark had taken his own life. This unconfirmed but widely accepted reality reframes his entire story. The quiet retreat to Lebanon was not, perhaps, a peaceful retirement, but a long, slow battle with the demons of depression and a sense of profound loss. The silence that followed his career wasn't just an absence of new music. It was the sound of a man struggling in the dark, away from the prying eyes of the world that had once celebrated him. This is the unspoken controversy of Mark Gray's life. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the music industry's responsibility to the artists it employs. Does the industry have a duty of care that extends beyond a recording contract? What happens to these sensitive, creative souls when the lights are turned off and they are left to grapple with a future they never imagined? Mark's story suggests that the emotional toll of being chewed up and spit out by the fame machine can be devastating, and in some cases, fatal. His life wasn't a public controversy, but his death serves as a quiet, heartbreaking indictment of the system he was a part of. He wasn't just a forgotten star. He was a man who, in the eyes of many, was left behind. The legacy of Mark Gray is a complicated tapestry, woven with threads of brilliant success and haunting tragedy. It's a story that resonates far beyond the confines of country music, speaking to broader themes of ambition, memory, and the human cost of our entertainment culture. His significance is not found in a long list of accolades or a place in the Country Music Hall of Fame. Instead, it lies in the questions his life and death compel us to ask. On one level, his musical legacy is concrete and undeniable, even if it is often overlooked. As a songwriter, he was a key architect of the sound of early 80s country pop. The number one hits he wrote for Exile in Alabama are still staples of classic country radio. Millions of people know his work, even if they don't know his name. He was a craftsman of the highest order, a melody maker whose hooks were inescapable and whose emotional instincts were spot on. His contribution to the Nashville songbook is secure. His solo work, though brief, remains a treasure for those who seek it out. His voice was a unique instrument, a soulful, tender tenor that stood apart from the more traditional baritones that dominated the genre. And his duet with Tammy Wynette, Sometimes When We Touch, remains a towering achievement. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated emotional power, a snapshot of two incredible vocalists connecting on a deeply human level. It stands as a testament to what he was capable of at the peak of his powers. More importantly, his story has become a touchstone for discussions about mental health within the creative community. His presumed suicide, while never officially confirmed, has opened up conversations in Nashville about the psychological toll of the industry. It serves as a tragic example of the isolation and despair that can follow the loss of a career, a purpose, and a public identity. The silence surrounding his death has, paradoxically, made the conversation louder. It reminds us that behind every "where are they now" story is a human being navigating a complex and often painful reality. The haunting final chapter of his life forces us to confront the human cost of the entertainment we consume so casually. It reminds us that artists are not just voices on a radio or faces on a screen. They are fragile human beings navigating immense pressures, both public and private. Mark Gray's story is a quiet tragedy that speaks volumes about the loneliness that can exist even in a life filled with applause. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph can be found in his own words, sung to his most trusted companion. "This old piano knows the truth." It's a line that captures the essence of his artistic soul, a man who poured his joys, his sorrows, and his deepest secrets into his music. The world may have stopped listening, but the piano always knew. Mark Gray's music is still here. His voice is frozen in time, waiting to be rediscovered. And if we listen closely, we can still hear the truth he was trying to tell us all along. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.